It's great to be here, and super proud of what you guys are all building at AcreTrader. I wrote about it in the book. I talk about it all the time. And what I particularly love about the AcreTrader story is that the Carter story of being in San Francisco, but deciding to start this company and moving back to Arkansas because it was a better place to build a company is exactly what we're seeing all across the country. So, but I'll get back to your question. So, to set the stage, when we started AOL, in 1985, so 37 years ago, only 3% of people were online. And those 3% were online an average of 1 hour a week. So it was early. And most people, frankly, didn't think it ever would be a big deal. Most people were skeptical that average people would ever see a reason to be on the internet. Maybe it would be a computer hobbyist thing, but never be a mainstream thing. And it took us really a decade before we kind of finally broke through. And a couple of times we almost hit the wall and had to go through layoffs and so forth. So it was not like an overnight success at all. What I loved about the idea from the earliest time we were pursuing it was it seemed like it would level the playing field and create new and better ways to get people information, education, commerce, communication, a whole slew of things. And that obviously has happened. And I think that part has been, awesome. And some of the companies that have, grown up out of that are just, really amazing. In terms of some of the unintended consequences that have surprised me or disappointed me, I always thought that community, social media, one of the great things about it, it would kind of help unite us. That you'd have a sense of other perspectives instead of just, watching one television set or reading one newspaper. You'd have a broader array of voices. You'd be a little bit more informed. Kind of been the opposite. On the internet and on cable television, people tended to, sadly, kind of live in their own little filter bubble and only listen to views that kind of reinforce their own views and not really understand the other side of it. So that's an area that has been, disappointing. I guess the other positive, particularly in the last 2.5 years during the pandemic, it was striking to me, given that early days I mentioned at the outset, that essentially the whole world suddenly was operating on the internet. Businesses, classrooms, it was sort of, it went from something when we started nobody knew about or cared about to suddenly something that people could live without. So, those were some of the observations.
Thank you. And did you have time to sign my disc?
Of course. I haven't got my Sharpie.
I got you.
You have your own Sharpie. You travel with your own Sharpie. When you come out with a book, you go around with a Sharpie. It's the weirdest thing. You always have a Sharpie. What's your name?
Yingsan. Phil. P-H-U-O-N-G.
Say it again. So slow.
P-H.
P-H-U-O-N-G. U-N-O-G. There you go.
Thank you, sir.
You can have your pen back. Next question.
My question is for a young or a beginner entrepreneur. What is the most important skill or character trait or thing that they should develop in themselves? And then how does that blossom or work out in their future businesses?
That's a great question. I'd say it's hard to pick one. I think persistence is a big deal. Most things, like Mark Zuckerberg got lucky. He started this thing in a dorm room, and like a year or two later, it was a global phenomenon. Good for him. 99% of the time, it's a slog and it's a struggle. More like I was saying, our company, 10 years, and that seemed like an overnight sensation, but it was a long 10 years. So I think persistence, you believe it, and your idea, just sticking with it. And even when there's skeptics, and my parents called me and said, "Doesn't seem to be working. Are you thinking maybe there's a plan B, like get a real job?" I said, "No, I still think it might work." So just the persistence. The other is you have to be able to tolerate a lot of ambiguity. If you move forward, there's a lot of things that people who are control freaks, it's really hard. It is like there are a lot of elements. There's some things you can control, obviously should control, but many things you can't control. So you have to be able to kind of have just be able to deal with that. And you also need to be super curious. I think part of being an entrepreneur is kind of being open to different, people, ideas, perspectives. And over time, you get a little sharper in your own thinking about what you're doing based on some of the questions, including some of the tough questions. I remember, when we were raising money early on or when we were going public, there's some, tough questions. They're like, oh, good point. I think I need to think about that one a little more. And the last point, which really in some ways the most important point, is in some ways in this country, there's too much of a celebration of the entrepreneur, the Carter Malloy, or the thing. And it's a team sport. And so the team you build is really, the key. And so you can't really do much without the right team. And so, just having understanding that constantly, not thinking about where you are now, but thinking about what the company likely will look like 2 years from now, and start making the moves now so you're prepared for that. Those would be some of them. But if I had to pick one, as I said, it's just persistence, because this is not a game for the, for people who aren't willing to stick it out. There'll be many times that it will feel frustrating, almost impossible. And I just remind myself of what Nelson Mandela said once. It always seems impossible until it happens. So you got to stick with it.
I have a follow-up question to that. So you talk about persistence, and you also describe yourself as an optimist. And also, I just want to say, first of all, thank you for the visibility you bring to the Heartland region with this movement. I have the great joy of heading up the HR function here, and the attention that things like this bring to this region make it so much easier for us to recruit people from California and New York and Chicago. And it is a really exciting wave to get to ride.
Right, well, thank you.
So thank you. Makes my job.
Well, the most important thing for you all to do is to be really successful, because the most. Yes. We're kind of counting on you, and some of this is because we're investors and obviously want to, generate return, but it's mostly because we're, out there pushing the idea pretty hard that companies like AcreTrader, should get the support of investors and media and so, attention of media and so forth. And whether they're in Fayetteville or in Silicon Valley or something. And we also make the case that investors in places on the coast should pay more attention to what's happening elsewhere. Obviously, that's happened with the last round here. But that all falls apart if we aren't able to generate top-tier returns for the fund, and the companies we back don't surprise the world and build some significant, iconic companies. So don't screw it up. Now your question.
Speaking of optimism, you talked about persistence in answer to Miles' question, and a lot of that is being optimistic, being relentlessly excited and opportunistic about what you're building. When do you kind of hit that tension between optimism and pragmatism, and especially as an entrepreneur, especially in a startup capacity, where you're relentlessly excited and hopeful about what you're building and doing and the opportunity, and then you have to,
adjust.
Answer to your parents who say, when are you going to go get a real job?
Yeah, and entrepreneurship, like, other things in life, you get, cold water in the face a lot of times. Something's changed, didn't expect it, didn't want it, but kind of have to adjust to it. And so it's your point about pragmatism. I think they're highly compatible. I think you have to kind of keep your eye on the prize while being very thoughtful, very pragmatic, very crafty about how you get from here to here to here to here. Never losing sight of what you're really trying to accomplish, but recognizing it's not a straight line, and there will be some bumps in the road that are problematic. One in particular, I remember I spent 6 months. We started outside of Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia, but in 1987, I decided the next step for our company, we had to get a partnership with Apple, which at the time, this is before Apple became the Apple you all know about. It was, the Apple II, the Macintosh had just come out, but it was a real force. had to get a deal with Apple. So I actually moved to San Francisco for 6 months, and every single day went to the Apple headquarters, trying to find somebody who I could get to agree to do something with us. And after like 3 or 4 months, the security guard, I think, felt so sorry for me. I thought it was so pathetic. He gave me like a guest pass or something, so I didn't have to kind of go through security every day. Eventually found somebody. I thought that was great, and they licensed the Apple brand name to us, which they'd never done before. Yay! We launched the service, and a year later, Apple decides, come to think of it, this was a mistake. We don't want to work with you. We don't want somebody else to have our Apple brand, blah, blah, blah. So, we negotiated a settlement to walk away, and we couldn't call it Apple Inc. anymore, so we had to rename it, and that's when we launched America Online. And out of that near disaster, it ended up driving our success. So that's an example of problem, how do you turn it into opportunity, and also kind of taking the long view and but being super pragmatic and flexible in terms of what you need to do now, what you need to do next month, what you need to do next year, so you're moving down that path. I used to call it, I always saw with the internet, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. Sometimes the tunnel seemed very long and the lights just seemed very flickering, but there was always, kind of that light, and we just kept moving forward, but adjusting constantly based on what the market was telling us, what our partners were telling us, what our customers were telling us. Other questions?
I'm Harrison. I'm on our marketing team, and I know starting your career, you had a marketing background. You came in as
Right.
marketing, if I'm not mistaken. But a large part of what we're doing, especially for AcreTrader, is trying to educate an audience of investors that hasn't really considered land investing or farmland investing, make it mainstream. So I'm just kind of curious your perspective and what the journey was like trying to educate the public on your product, and if there was a tipping point there somewhere, kind of what that.
Yeah, it was, as I said before, it was a long journey because most people were skeptical. Most people, I'll give you a couple of examples, which I know seems crazy now, but trust me, this is what I was dealing with. People would say, do you really think that like a normal person will sit at a computer with a keyboard and type a message to somebody when they could just pick up the phone and call them? So the idea, email, instant messaging, all texting, all this stuff, is like, this seemed like maybe a niche thing, but it's never a mainstream. The other one with e-commerce, do you really think like normal people will ever trust typing their credit card into this internet thing and sending it to somebody they've never met, trusting that they'll send some product back? And of course, we all take that for granted as well. But in those early days, people didn't believe it. They didn't believe for a decade. So it was constant partnerships that could help accelerate our growth and kind of credential us a little bit, give us some credibility we might not have on our own, looking for specific niches where we could get traction around a particular idea, constantly selling the idea of Carter asked while we were doing the photos. You get used to this, like photos and like all. I said, you're in the business of storytelling, my friend. You got to tell the story. And I for most of my career, I've been telling the story. For a while, it was the story of the internet. Now it's the story of the rise of rest and entrepreneurship all around the country. But you got to keep persisting. And eventually, to your point, eventually you hit a tipping point. Eventually, it goes from skeptic to people are starting to buy it. And we've seen that even with the rise of rest. It started happening a little bit before the pandemic, and it accelerated after the pandemic. And now what seemed 10 years ago silly, fanciful, good for him, but there's no way he's going to be, it's going to work out, to, kind of interesting. And, more and more companies like an AcreTrader having success, scaling up, open people's eyes to it. So I think it goes back to the persistence and just looking for those opportunities, looking for things to, ways to get people to change their minds. Other questions?
What do you see as the biggest differences for entrepreneurs getting
started today versus when you started American Online in 1985?
It's a little bit, kind of in some ways the same. It's like two sides of the coin. What's easier is when I was starting, actually I should say, we started AOL in 85. I actually wanted to get into the internet in 1980 when I graduated from college. But when I graduated from college, there's no investors backing college graduates, inconceivable. And there were really no internet companies to go to because it still was an idea, nothing really to it. And at the time, it actually was illegal for consumers or business to be on the internet. It was restricted to government agencies and educational institutions. So I ended up working for some big companies, Procter & Gamble, PepsiCo for a while, but I knew I wanted to do that. I was just trying to figure out how to get into that. So what's gotten easier is the whole idea of entrepreneurship is much more mainstream. ASU actually has an entrepreneurial dorm. But none of that, when I was in college. So that's one aspect. It's also, there is more venture capital, a lot more venture capital all across the country. And in the last 10 years, which is one of the things we're super excited by, in these rise of the rest cities, there's 1,400 new venture firms that didn't exist 10 years ago. So it's easier to raise capital. Still not as easy as it should be, and still harder for some people in some places, but easier than it was then. The flip side is if entrepreneurship is celebrated more and capital is somewhat more accessible, more people pursue that. So every market is going to be more competitive. So it's easier to get started, but harder to succeed, harder to really scale. The idea that you have some unique product or service that nobody else has ever figured out, and you're just going to, go out there and, kind of run with it. When I hear those pitches, I say, okay, if you have no competition, either it's not that good an idea, or you do have competition and you don't know it, scary, or you do have competition and you do know it, but you're not telling me, scarier still. So, every market is hyper-competitive, therefore it requires execution, which means, getting the right team, focus on the right priorities, making sure you have access to enough capital to run the plays you need to run, ground game and passing game to run them so that you can out-execute the competitors as opposed to outthink them. Anything else?
What keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night? We've made progress, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And I worry greatly that we live in a hyper-partisan country that is divided. And I worry that there was a survey a few years ago that was sort of like, keeps me up at night, from Pew, that said 70% of Americans wake up in the morning fearful and anxious about the future. We're focused on doing new things, good jobs, we're innovating, we're in the minority. The majority are anxious and fearful. So how do you create more opportunity for more people in more places? So more people, instead of feeling left out and left behind, feel like they can be part of the future. I think it's the only way as a country we can continue to lead as the most innovative entrepreneurial nation in the world, which is no guarantees. And it's, I think the only way, to try to unify a divided country. There is a big opportunity gap. We have to close it. So I feel like we're making progress, but I still recognize maybe instead of 70%, it's 69%, but it's still a lot. So that worries me.
One more, John?
Just one quick question. I'm Kelly Sikorsky. I work in finance, and I was just wondering if you had any advice for startups navigating through recession.
Well, the good news for AcreTrader, you just raised a boatload of money at a pretty good valuation. So my advice, particularly to finance people, is keep an eye on that stack of cash. And be careful, because some of these things may take longer in terms of burn rate and things like that. So there's a little bit of that pragmatism, but you're way better positioned than most companies because you're super well capitalized and have a 2 or 3 year runway, which is not typical. That said, it's an extraordinary opportunity. When the market moves into this kind of probably recession mode, it does make it harder for people with ideas to raise capital. But it actually makes it easier for them to disrupt. And the reason for that is invariably the big companies, the incumbents in every sector, start playing defense. First thing they do is they freeze hiring. Second thing they do, they start doing some, layoffs. Third thing they do is they cut their innovation initiatives. We say, well, this seems like a good idea, but it'll probably take 5 or 10 years. Just cut it. Well, maybe we do it down the road. When that happens, and the big companies shift to being a little more tactical, a little more short-term oriented, a little more defense, kind of protect what they have, not kind of try to, expand in new ways. That creates an opportunity for new disruptive companies to fill some of those vacuums, and which is why you see during the difficult economic times, people are always surprised that a bunch of huge, significant companies end up getting burst there. So, recognize it's nobody knows exactly what's going to happen here, but probably will take longer, not shorter, to get out of this, and people will be unsettled, and that likely, maybe, as I said before, might impact how many new people you can get as investors on the platform, things like that. So it creates some short-term hurdles for every company, but in the long run, for most companies, it actually creates it's like there's an opening on the field, that you have a clearer path to get to the goal line. So it should fuel a wave of innovation over the next decade for the entrepreneurs who have big ideas, can assemble the right team, who figure out a way to access capital, and can be smart about, kind of prioritizing what they need to do to capitalize on the opportunity.